The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. There's a moment after the healing, after the crying, the journaling, the EMDR sessions, the spiritual retreats when the fire just dies. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in a crisis, but in silence. Cold, still, and final. You wake up one day and nothing burns anymore. No urgency, no drive, no hunger. You stare at your goals like a stranger. You scroll through your old vision boards and feel nothing. The dream career, the ideal partner, the house with the balcony facing east, they all feel like set pieces from someone else's life. You tell your therapist you feel empty. They ask if you're depressed. But this doesn't feel like depression. This feels like an absence of lies. It's worse. Because deep down, you can't even pretend to care anymore. You're not broken. You're not sad. You're just done. As if the fuel that once kept you alive has evaporated. Like your old self was running on gasoline made from fear, and something finally turned off the pipeline. And now in the silence, something terrifying whispers. You weren't ambitious. You were afraid. Let that sink in. What if all the goals you chased were never about growth but escape? What if you weren't chasing success but running from shame? We call it burnout. Jung called it something else. The dissolution of the persona. And nobody tells you how dead it feels when the mask falls off. Because healing doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like walking through your own life as a ghost. Sometimes it feels like you performed the exorcism only to realize the demon was the only thing that ever got you out of bed in the morning. You didn't lose your motivation. You exiled the part of yourself that needed to be liked. You buried the part that believed love must be earned. You finally silenced the voice screaming, be more, be worthy, be enough. And now, there's no voice left. Just the void. But this void, this desert of silence, it isn't the end. It's the beginning of something you can't yet name. This is where we start. Not where you feel alive, but where you no longer feel the need to fake it. This is the part where most people turn back. Where they run toward the next job, the next dopamine hit, the next performance. Because silence is unbearable when you've lived your whole life inside a scream. But you didn't come here for more noise. You came here to find out what's left of you when the performance ends. Welcome to the in-between. This is where your soul stops performing. This is where your ego dies. This is where the truth begins. You thought you were healing so you could return to the life you once had. But that was never the assignment. Shadow work doesn't bring you back to normal. It dismantles the entire definition of what you used to call a life. And once the mask is off, once the machinery of your motivation is laid bare, there's no going back. Let's get brutally honest. For most of your life, you weren't ambitious. You were terrified. You weren't driven. You were hunted. You weren't goal-oriented. You were trauma-reactive. You called it vision, but it was vigilance. You called it focus, but it was fear. You called it hard work, but it was hypervigilance disguised as discipline. And every time someone praised your discipline, your productivity, your resilience, they were applauding the very systems your wounded inner child built to survive. But here's the nightmare part, no one warns you about. When you finally heal those wounds, when you pull the splinters from your psyche, the whole architecture collapses. That's what Jung meant when he said the collapse of the persona is often mistaken for depression. It's not sadness. It's the end of your performance. You stop chasing love. You stop proving your worth. You stop trying to earn your place in the world. And then, you don't know what to do with yourself. Because the only version of you that's ever existed was the one running from pain. So now what? You're standing in an open field where your old motivations have burned to ash. And no new seeds have sprouted. People tell you to get back on track. They tell you to reignite your fire. They send you podcasts, morning routines, biohacking tips, affirmations. But nothing lands, nothing sticks. Because here's the truth. You're not supposed to go back. The voice inside you that says, I don't care about this anymore, isn't depression. It's wisdom. It's your soul refusing to rebuild the prison you once called purpose. Let's pause here. Look at the goals you once chased. The degrees, the relationship, the job, the social media presence, the high-value lifestyle. Ask yourself, where did that desire come from? Who taught you to want it? Whose love did you think it would finally win? Whose silence did you hope it would break? If you're honest, truly honest, you'll find that much of your ambition was just your nervous system screaming for safety in a world that told you survival must be earned. So what happens when you stop needing to survive? When the fear-based fuel runs out, you feel nothing. And that nothingness is sacred. It's not the absence of meaning. It's the space where true meaning can finally be born. This is what Jung called the Negredo phase, the blackening. The death of the false self. Alchemy called it the necessary dissolution. Spiritual traditions call it the dark night of the soul. Modern culture calls it burnout and sells you supplements. But you can't medicate your way through spiritual death. You have to feel the emptiness. You have to face the silence. You have to sit in the ash until the whisper comes. Because the whisper is real. And the scream was a lie. Let me ask you something no one dares to. What if your personal development journey was just another way to control yourself? What if all the healing, the meditation, the manifestation journals were just polished tools used by your ego to improve the mask instead of removing it? You started shadow work thinking it would fix you. But real shadow work doesn't fix anything. It burns. It dismembers. It dismantles the self you spent your whole life perfecting. And it doesn't stop at wounding. It goes after your attachments to identity, to purpose, to achievement, to your precious idea of being a good person. Because here's the trick of the psyche. It would rather be in pain than be in unknown. It would rather hustle to win approval than sit in the discomfort of I don't know who I am anymore. So you set goals. You become the best version of yourself. You chase wellness like it's a finish line. But secretly you're still haunted by the same fear. If I stop performing, will anyone stay? And here's the haunting truth. The ego doesn't care if you're healed. It only cares if you're safe. So long as your progress fits the rules of capitalism, of social media, of family approval, you're allowed to grow. But the moment your growth demands the death of your persona, you're called lost, lazy, unmotivated, sick. Because you're no longer useful to the machine. You no longer wake up to build an empire. You no longer care about productivity hacks. You no longer burn your soul for likes and status and metrics. That's when the world calls you broken. But you're not broken. You're just done being manipulated. Done being defined by what you produce. Done living in constant performance for other people's love. And in the space that remains in that terrifying silence, your soul waits. Not to rush in with a new 5-year plan, but to ask, what would it feel like to live without needing to be impressive? It's a question most people will never dare answer. Because the answer might undo everything they've built. And that's why the void isn't just painful, it's heretical. To sit in it is to rebel against everything you were taught about value success worth. It's to say, I'm not playing this game anymore. And that's the first real breath of freedom you've ever taken. But here's where it gets harder. Because after the collapse, after the dust settles, nothing happens. No lightning bolt, no divine purpose, no magical clarity. Just nothing. You still wake up empty. And in a world obsessed with forward motion, stillness feels like failure. But you are not failing. You're just finally obeying the laws of the self. And the self doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in spirals, in whispers, in dreams. It leads you not toward achievement, but toward integration. Toward the truth of who you were before the world told you who to be. Have you noticed something strange? You're calmer now. Quieter. People around you even say you seem better. But deep inside, something doesn't sit right. Not because you're hurting, but because you're not chasing anymore. And for a system built entirely on chasing, stillness is war. Let's break the illusion. Most people don't want peace. They want the idea of peace that doesn't require giving up their ego's delusions. They want meditation, but not the death of their self-image. They want healing, but not the grief of losing who they thought they were. They want joy, but only if it comes with productivity. So when you stop caring about performance, when you stop trying to monetize every interest, when your hobbies stop being content, when your career stops being your identity, the system doesn't celebrate your growth. It calls it a crisis. And here's why your stillness makes others confront their chaos. You become a mirror. Not the flattering kind, but the one that reflects how fake their motivation is. They'll say, you used to be so passionate. Don't give up on your dreams. You're wasting your potential. But they're not worried about your future. They're afraid of what your silence reveals about their present. Because when your life no longer revolves around proving your worth, you become dangerous. Dangerous to your company, to your family, to every system that profits off your fear of being nobody. You stop playing the part. You stop dancing for approval. You start asking dangerous questions like, who am I when no one is watching? Would I still do this if I wasn't afraid of being invisible? And that's where the old world starts to crumble. You realize you don't miss your old dreams. You miss having a reason to run. Because the dream wasn't the point, the running was. The hustle, the chase, the anxiety disguised as ambition. Now the chase is over, and you're left standing in a strange new landscape. No map, no guide, just an unfamiliar stillness and a whisper you're afraid to trust. Here's the truth. No one says out loud, going back won't save you. You can try, you can rebuild the persona, you can find a new job, a new identity, a new mask, but it won't hold. Because once you've seen the machinery behind the curtain, you can't pretend it's magic again. Once you've tasted truth, falsehood makes you sick. And your soul now awake will sabotage anything that asks you to perform again. That's why nothing works anymore. That's why every next step feels like a lie, because you've already burned the bridge back. Now it's time to ask, what if stillness isn't where growth ends, but where real growth begins? The world has no language for what you're going through, so it gives you the wrong one. It calls it burnout, it calls it laziness, it calls it depression. But this isn't that. You're not sad, you're not broken, you're not lost. You're simply no longer available for a life that was built on fear. And that's not depression, that's spiritual disobedience. But here's the terrifying part. You don't yet know who you are without fear. So you float, you drift, you wait. This is the liminal space Carl Jung warned us about, the void between personas, between identities, between falsehood and truth. It is a psychic corridor, not a prison, not a diagnosis, an initiation. And like all initiations, it strips you of everything that was never yours. Here's what most people don't understand. Healing isn't just about becoming happy. It's about becoming real. And the path to realness. It doesn't feel like joy. It feels like death. Death of illusions. Death of compulsions. Death of identities that were never truly chosen. This is why ancient traditions treated the void with reverence. They called it negredo in alchemy. They called it shamanic death in indigenous rites. They called it the dark night of the soul in mysticism. They understood that silence is sacred, that confusion is cleansing, that meaning doesn't arrive on command. But in modern culture, we diagnose the in-between. We pathologize the sacred pause. We turn holy stillness into a problem to be fixed. Because a silent soul isn't productive. A soul in transition doesn't make good content. It doesn't hustle. It doesn't post. It doesn't perform. And so we rush it. We shame it. We medicate it. We try to run from the void instead of sitting inside it. But Jung warned us, if you avoid the darkness, you'll project it onto others. And that's the tragedy of avoiding this space. You don't escape it. You just prolong the exile. You end up building a new life that looks different on the outside, but is still ruled by the same unconscious patterns. You look awakened, but inside you're still in bondage. So what does true initiation ask of you? It asks you to stop pretending, to stop grasping, to let your old self rot so something real can grow. That doesn't look like morning routines or goal-setting journals. That looks like waking up in a life you no longer recognize and having the courage not to rush into fixing it. It looks like trusting that the silence is not empty but pregnant, that the nothingness is not a void but a womb, that what's dying is not you, but the lie of who you were trying to be. And that is sacred. So stop calling this depression. Call it what it is. A holy dismantling, an ego death, a return to truth. You are not broken. You are being remade. It doesn't come with fanfare. There's no applause. No angels descending. No aha moment etched in gold. The first sign that something new is arriving after the collapse is a whisper, a flicker, a thread, so subtle that your rational mind almost dismisses it. It might be a passing curiosity, a strange attraction to something seemingly small, a topic, a place, a color, a child's laughter, a building's decay. And for the first time in months, you don't feel dread. You don't feel panic. You feel pulled. No urgency, no plan, just resonance. And if you're brave enough to follow that resonance without needing to monetize it, explain it, or justify it, you begin, not with a leap, but with a still step. This is what Jung called the emergence of the self. The self doesn't demand your attention. It doesn't scream like your ego. It doesn't bargain, threaten, or seduce. The self invites. And in a world addicted to urgency, invitation is almost imperceptible. Because the self knows this. What's real doesn't compete. So while your ego chased status metrics, likes, lovers, promotions, the self sat quietly in the corner of your soul, waiting for you to get tired of pretending. And now in the aftermath of collapse, you are finally quiet enough to hear it. But here's the paradox. The whisper doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't give you clarity. It gives you presence. And presence is dangerous because it has no timeline. You start walking, but you don't know where the path leads. You begin creating, but you're not sure if anyone will ever see it. You speak, but you no longer care who listens. And that is when you know you're not performing anymore. You're not responding to fear. You're responding to truth. The whisper says, you don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to be someone you're not. You're allowed to move slowly. And for the first time, you believe it. You stop asking what's the point and start asking what feels alive. That's the shift. That's the resurrection. But it doesn't look like victory. It looks like walking barefoot in a forest at dawn with no map, no destination, but a heart that finally knows what stillness tastes like. So you keep walking, not because you're chasing something, but because something within you has finally awakened and wants to be moved. You used to crave clarity. You used to need certainty like oxygen. A plan, a strategy, a defined identity. Something to hold on to because without it you feared you'd collapse. But the self has no interest in clarity that comes from control. It doesn't play by the ego's rules. It replaces clarity with something far more uncomfortable and far more powerful. Curiosity. And this is where the old you starts to panic. Because curiosity isn't safe. It doesn't give you guarantees. It doesn't promise success. It doesn't come with a certificate or followers or a stable paycheck. It just pulls you gently toward what you don't fully understand. And here's the shocking part. That pull. It might be the first authentic impulse you've felt in your entire life. Let me say it clearly. The self doesn't scream, "This is who you are." It asks what feels alive right now. And you used to performing don't know how to answer that. Because aliveness doesn't schedule itself. It doesn't build empires on trauma responses. It doesn't sprint to prove anything. It just moves. This is what happened to David. Remember him, the architect who used to obsess over blueprints and deliverables. After his collapse, he stopped chasing clarity. He started walking literally, without a goal, without a watch, without a podcast playing in his ears. Just walking. And on one of those walks, he noticed a crumbling building. Something about it made his breath catch. Not because he saw a business opportunity, not because it could go viral on Instagram, but because something spoke to him. It wasn't a thought. It was a vibration. A silent chord struck somewhere between memory and mystery. He didn't analyze it. He didn't monetize it. He just listened. He kept walking back to that place, sketching it, feeling it. Not for output, but for intimacy. And slowly, without any force, an idea began to grow. Not a product, not a plan, but a possibility. Something that wanted to come into form through him. Not from ambition, but from alignment. That's the kind of life that emerges when curiosity becomes your compass. Not a hustle, a hum, not a performance, a pulse. And here's what might shock you most. That kind of life creates more impact, more beauty, and more fulfillment than anything your ego ever built on urgency. Because it's real, it's rooted, it's yours. And it's not chasing anything, because it already belongs. Let's be honest. In a world drunk on speed, slowness is a rebellion. We don't just worship hustle, we deify it. Every second must be optimized. Every passion must be monetized. Every breath must lead to something measurable. Slowness, that's failure. But what if the most sacred thing you can do right now is nothing? What if silence isn't laziness but preparation? What if pausing isn't regression but resurrection? See, your ego was trained in a world that equates worth with output. Do more, be more, share more. Hustle harder, never stop. So when you stop, your ego panics. Because for years, stillness meant worthlessness. Rest meant you're falling behind. But your self doesn't measure life in metrics. It doesn't care how many steps you walked, how many posts you made, how many milestones you reached by 30. It cares about one thing. Are you home? Not in a physical house, but in your body, in your breath, in your moment. The self isn't urgent, it's timeless. And it's whispering something the ego will never understand. There's nothing to prove. Let that land. Because once you truly hear that, the shackles begin to fall. You no longer chase connection, you become it. You no longer beg for inspiration, you notice it. You no longer demand meaning, you create it. But here's the catch. Slowness is confronting. It brings up everything you tried to outrun. The shame, the unworthiness, the emptiness beneath all you're doing. And that's why people stay busy. Not because they're passionate, but because they're terrified of what silence will say. But you've entered the silence willingly. You're letting the ghosts speak. You're not numbing. You're not distracting. You're listening. And that, more than any success story, is the real beginning of a new life. A life that moves with rhythm, not pressure. With breath, not panic. With truth, not urgency. So take the walk, without your phone. Take the nap, without guilt. Take the day, without an agenda. And let the slowness rebuild you. Because in that slowness, something holy is moving. It doesn't look like achievement. It looks like returning. To yourself, to stillness, to soul. Before you were ambitious, before you became the achiever, the caretaker, the good girl, the grinder, you were a child. And that child didn't care about proving anything. He didn't need followers. She didn't need six-figure careers. They didn't need external validation. They just were. Present, open, alive, curious. Then the world came and taught you how to earn love. Not feel it, earn it. With grades, with politeness, with performance. The child learned fast. Love is conditional. Joy is indulgent. Silence is suspicious. And being you dangerous. So you adapted, you split, you performed. You buried the curious child under layers of strategy. You forgot what delight felt like. You confused tension with purpose. And worst of all, you built a life to protect the mask, not the soul behind it. That mask became your face, your name, your brand, until shadow work ripped it off, until healing yanked you back into that forgotten room in your psyche, where that child still sits, waiting, not for applause, but for reunion. See, the self isn't a brand new identity. It's the reclamation of your original essence before trauma taught you to become digestible. And here's what the self wants to know. Can you love the one who didn't earn it? Can you hold the you that nobody celebrated? Can you be loyal to what you actually love, even if no one claps? The reason you feel empty after healing is because you've been stripped of the mask, but haven't yet embraced the child. You killed the performance, but haven't kissed the soul. And so you float, not because you're broken, but because you're being asked to remember. What made you feel alive before you were told what should? What did you care about before value was defined by output? Who were you before the world told you to become someone else? You'll know when you find it. It won't scream, it won't hustle, it won't seduce. It will feel like an echo, a soft knock, a faint whisper. I'm still here. Can we play again? And when you answer that whisper, your life begins again. Not from ambition, but from truth. Not from anxiety, but from wholeness. Not from proving, but from remembering. Let's talk about relationships, because here's a hard truth no one prepares you for after healing. The more whole you become, the lonelier it might feel at first. Not because you're broken, but because you're no longer available for worship contracts. You know the ones. Where you were loved not for who you are, but for how well you performed the role. The rescuer, the savior, the one who had it all together. And at the center of those roles was one fatal dynamic. You weren't loved, you were needed. And so you became a god in their world. A protector, a provider, a source of direction. You thought it was intimacy? It was codependency in costume. Because the moment you faltered, the moment you questioned your script, the moment you dared to rest, they turned on you. Their devotion wasn't for your truth. It was for your usefulness. So you learned to stay elevated, to never break, to never need. But healing, it takes the God out of you and puts you back in your body. Suddenly you're no longer interested in being adored. You want to be seen. You want to be held, not handled. Heard, not worshipped. Met, not managed. And here's the twist. When you step down from the pedestal, some people will feel betrayed. They weren't with you. They were with the mask. And without the mask, they don't know who you are anymore. Worse, they don't want to. So they disappear, or rage, or try to pull you back into your role. That's not your failure. That's your freedom. You're no longer feeding illusions. You're no longer auditioning for conditional affection. And in that space, you may find yourself alone. But it's the kind of alone that clears the noise, that heals the trauma, that makes room for true connection. Where love isn't a transaction, it's a mirror. Where two whole people meet not to fix, not to save, but to witness. To breathe in each other's truth without trying to mold it into comfort. That's rare. But it's real, and it only comes when you stop being a god and start being human again. You can't bypass this part. No matter how many coaches you hire, no matter how many spiritual circles you join, no matter how many books you devour, there is a moment in your journey that no one can accompany you through. It is the sacred solitude, not isolation, not loneliness, but solitude. The quiet furnace where the old you melts and the real you begins to take shape. Carl Jung called it the individuation process, the point where you're no longer just healing your past, but becoming someone new. Not a better version of your past self, but a deeper version of your true self. And to do that, you have to walk alone. There are no shortcuts, no blueprints, no guarantees. Just you, your breath, your silence, and the ghosts of everything you thought you had to be. It's terrifying, because there's nothing to distract you from your inner terrain. No achievements to chase, no audience to impress, no partner to perform for. Just your raw existence. But in that rawness, something ancient awakens. You stop negotiating with reality. You stop blaming your past. You stop asking for permission. And you start listening. To the rhythms of your body, to the whispers in your intuition, to the strange pull toward what you cannot explain. This is where the self speaks clearest. Not in moments of clarity, but in long stretches of uncluttered presence. And it's here in the silence that you face the deeper initiation. Will you choose comfort or truth? Because the world will tempt you with distractions. It will offer you new personas to wear, new identities to inhabit, new performances to master. But the fire won't let you settle. Once you've stepped into the flame of solitude, you can never again sell your soul for applause. You will always know the difference between noise and nourishment, between flattery and connection, between urgency and resonance. And from that knowing, you begin to see differently. You notice what others miss, the beauty in the mundane, the patterns behind the pain, the tiny invitations that your old self would have ignored. This is the fire. Not to destroy you, but to purify you. To make sure that when you step into your next season, you're not dragging the corpse of who you used to be. You're walking as someone who knows not because you read it, but because you burned for it. There's something radical that happens when you stop chasing. You stop becoming a seeker, and start becoming a signal. You no longer run after love. You become love. You no longer beg for opportunities. You radiate alignment. You no longer ask, "Am I enough?" You simply exist in the frequency of wholeness. And the world begins to shift around you. Not because it changed, but because you're no longer operating from lack. This is not a mindset. This is energetic reality. You've emptied the vessel of false fuel, the desperation, the compulsion, the performance. And now you are a clear frequency. The self fully rooted doesn't chase, it draws. This is the paradox that your old self couldn't understand. The more you grasp, the more things slip. The more you rest, the more they arrive. Because when your energy no longer screams, "I need," it hums, "I am." And I am is enough. It's not arrogance, it's resonance. Your presence stops being a billboard. It becomes a tuning fork. And what's meant for you people, purpose, love, expression, it hears the frequency and begins to move toward you. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, naturally, unstoppably. Because wholeness is magnetic. It doesn't seduce, it signals. And those who once needed you to perform will either fall away or step up into truth. This is how relationships transform. This is how careers evolve. This is how the path unfolds. Not through manipulation, but through magnetism. But here's the secret. You can't fake it. You can't embody this state to get a result. The moment you perform wholeness, you've already left it. This isn't about what the world sees. It's about what you no longer needed to see. So what if the success you're craving was never meant to be hunted, but received? What if the love you ache for is waiting at the vibration you haven't allowed yourself to rest in yet? What if the silence wasn't the absence of life, but the threshold into the kind of life you've always deserved? A life that doesn't run on fear, that doesn't require urgency, that doesn't collapse when the applause stops. A life that moves from essence, a life where you don't push, you pulse. Now that you've stopped performing, a strange grief sets in. Not because you miss the old life, but because you realize how much of it wasn't real. How many of your victories were fear-driven? How many of your relationships were performance-based? How many of your authentic moments were really just well-rehearsed survival? And now in the quiet, there's no one to impress, no mirror to check, no algorithm to please. Just you and the invisible work of becoming. And this work, it's not glamorous. No one claps for emotional maturity. No one gives awards for nervous system regulation. No one promotes your boundaries on billboards. This is sacred work, soul work, silent work. The kind of work that changes everything but looks like nothing from the outside. You won't go viral for letting go of an old identity. You won't trend for choosing presence over performance. You won't get a trophy for breaking a generational pattern. But this is the work that rewrites timelines. This is the work that frees your children from the chains you carried. That heals your body from the stories it was forced to hold. That reclaims your soul from the noise that told you who you had to be. And here's the miracle. When you stop performing for the world, you begin to participate in it. Not as a character, but as a presence. Not for validation, but from alignment. You stop asking, "What should I create?" and start asking, "What wants to move through me?" You stop calculating your next step. You start listening for what life is asking you to become. You're not making content anymore. You're making contact. With life, with love, with the pulse of your own existence. This is the real success story. Not the one with the highlight reel, but the one where finally you no longer need one. Because you're not a performance anymore. You're a presence. And your presence, quiet, steady, unshakable, is the most powerful thing you've ever offered this world. So here you are. Not the person you once were, but not yet fully who you're becoming. Standing barefoot on the ashes of your former identity with no map, no script, no applause. Just presence. And a pulse that says, something new is beginning. Not because you forced it. Not because you hacked your mindset. Not because you manifested it perfectly. But because you finally stopped trying to become someone else and started allowing yourself to become real. That is the secret Jung never shouted because it couldn't be taught, only lived. The process of individuation isn't about improvement. It's about integration, about remembering the parts of you that were exiled, about burning the masks that never fit, about walking through the silence and discovering it was never empty, just honest. You didn't lose your motivation. You lost the fear that created it. You didn't lose your drive. You stopped driving toward illusions. You didn't collapse. You arrived. And now you get to create from fullness. You write not for validation, but because truth wants to take shape through you. You love not to fill a void, but because connection is your nature. You work not to prove yourself, but because your soul recognizes its own rhythm in what you do. This is the quiet revolution, the one no one sees, but everyone around you feels. Because when you become real, you give others permission to drop the act too. And together you stop performing for love and start living from it. So here's your choice. You can go back. Rebuild the old scaffolding. Chase old trophies with a smile that no longer fits. Or you can stay in this stillness, in this becoming, in this truth. And let your next life emerge not from effort, but from essence. Let it be slow, let it be sacred, let it be yours. Because the self doesn't roar, it doesn't demand, it waits until you're ready to hear. You are not behind, you are not broken, you are exactly where your real life begins. When you no longer need anyone to validate your worth, that's when you finally become worthy. If this video cracked something open inside you, if it gave a name to the silent transformation you're in, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Your words might be the mirror someone else needs to know they're not alone in this void. And if you're ready to keep walking this path, to explore more of the hidden currents of your psyche, to meet the self behind the masks, subscribe. This isn't just a video, this is a movement. A quiet one, but a real one. And it's just beginning. You were never lost. You were just becoming too real to be found by the fake.